Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ben Glenn, and this is a podcast that I am calling the 80s ADHD Guy. It's a reboot from a podcast that I started last October, and as many things, it went through a lot of changes and ebbs and flows, and this is where I am now. Being ADHD, it might change again. We don't know. I mean, that's why we're doing this podcast. But my original podcast was called the Unabridged Banglan, and I figured that, one, that might just confuse some people. There are some of you that hopefully will find this podcast just because of the name, the 80s ADHD Guy, as I began to think about, even though I've been a speaker and an artist for over 30 years and have talked a lot about ADHD and have written books and all that stuff, and we'll get into all those things. Some of you don't even know who Ben Glenn is. So if this is our first time, it's good to meet you. Also, I didn't really like my setup when I was recording the Unabridged Banglan podcast. I had to convince the boss, aka the Russian. That is, if you hear me refer to the Russian, that is my wife. Her name is Paulina. She is from Russia, but she's actually an Australian citizen. So yeah, that's an interesting story. But I tried to convince her to let me create a display that I was proud of. And as you can see in the background, this is the start of my Lego display. And you'll hear me talk a lot about Lego. It's something that I grew up with. It kind of helped me through all of my ADHD, gave me a sense of peace and focus. And I have actually been involved with an organization that I started. That's actually kind of funny, called giveyourbricks.com, where we do what we call the Chalk Guy Lego Drive every year. And we are in our 13th year. We've expanded and we've done all kinds of different things to create engagement, involvement, and just a lot of fun. In fact, that's what Lego means. A lot of people don't even know what Lego means. It means play well. And it's funny, I had to wait till I became 50 to really embrace that concept of, hey, we need to actually create space for play. And it's not something that we just reserve for elementary kids in recess and different things. As we get older, we need to continue to create that space, and we'll talk more about that. Hey, is this podcast already all over the place? Yes. If you have ADHD, you're tracking with me. The rest of you are like, I'm going to need some kind of a medication, Dramamine or something. So let me start off with who's Ben Glenn? Why am I doing this podcast? And what is my hope for this podcast? Well, I'm gonna be really honest with you. I'm doing this podcast because of the Russian. She loves podcasts, and she has a 45-minute commute every day, actually there and back. So she's always listening to different podcasts, and she just gave me that word of encouragement, which we've been married for almost 30 years. So I have learned to rely on that word of encouragement. She is my opposite. You'll hear me refer to her as my sympathetic enforcer. And so I trust her with everything. And she's amazing because she's my complete opposite. Now, that doesn't mean that she doesn't drive me crazy, and we'll talk about that too. But she's just like, hey, why don't you start just talking to a camera and sharing your experiences, your ups and downs, your all arounds. Just be authentic, be yourself. And so that's this. And so this, in some sense, is just kind of me processing. I'm going to work really hard not to perform and just be myself, which means occasionally I might drop a swear word here and there. I'm working on it. But I grew up, I had a really dirty mouth. I don't know why. It was just something that I gravitated towards. And sometimes I would use it for humor. Sometimes I'd use it for frustration. And now I'm trying to balance it out. You're going to hear me talk about my faith a little bit. This is not specifically a faith-driven podcast, but faith is a big part of my life. Actually just got done spending 3 years as a youth pastor. So that there's going to be a lot of stories that I'll bring up about that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm working on my swearing. There's this Bible verse in the book of James that talks about taming the tongue. And those of you that have ADHD, whether you believe in the Bible or not, that's actually a really good thing to know, because we can create discipline and have control over the things that we say and not be so impulsive, which is our ADHD way. So this is going to be really just raw and real. As much as I'd like to say there's not going to be a lot of ums, you knows, and likes, I can't promise that, because I'm literally having a conversation with the camera. I am preparing and just like typing out some different things, some talking points. Eventually, I'm hoping to have some guests on here. But just to start things off, I just want to just dive into all things ADHD as it would relate to somebody who grew up in the 80s, because things have absolutely changed. And I think that my hope is that the things that I learned and had to deal with in the 80s could be an encouragement for those that are trying to battle things here now in 2024. Things have absolutely have changed. We did not have the social media. We did not have the anxiety that everybody has now because of the access that we have to all of the world, the incredible amount of distractions. But there was also, I feel that back then there was maybe an element of grit. There was an element of, hey, you need to just shake off the dust and get back up and keep moving forward, where it feels like, and I've seen reels and memes and whatever. And oh, by the way, this could be cancel bait for Banglan. When I was working at the church, a lot of my students would come up and be like, Pastor Ben, you're going to get canceled. Because there are certain things that we did and thought and felt back in the 80s that now today are kind of like, yeah, that's a no-no. That's offensive. And part of that is just we were taught, hey, if you fall down, get back up and keep moving forward. And today it seems like that is a little bit more challenging. Today it feels like it is fall down, stay down, talk about why you're down, talk about how you're feeling because you're down. And sometimes what I'm noticing is that we stay down in our trauma and the struggle, and we never actually make our way out. And so I'm hoping that through this journey of me kind of just sharing my thoughts on the things that I've learned, that those of you that are maybe a little bit younger listening to this will get some encouragement, maybe some different tips and techniques, maybe just see something a little bit differently. I think that one thing that I really loved about the 3 years working with students at the church, and I was in charge of middle school and high school, but my favorite was when my coworker Shalonda would rope me into working with the kids ministry, and I was hanging out with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. They're my favorite, because I really am just a big junior high kid. I love fun. I think boogers are cool. No, not really. Well, maybe. No, they're disgusting. But my wife always jokes. She's just like, yeah, you're their level. And maybe that's true. So, but I'm hoping that by sharing this podcast, if you're a little bit younger, you will move past the fact that, hey, this guy's in his 50s. And some of my students had to really work past that. They're like, oh, he's just the old guy. What does he know? And I don't know where this comes from, but if you're not the young, hip, cool guy up front, but you're a little bit older and your hair kind of has decided to migrate, or to, in my case, just leave, well, you don't know much, or you're not savvy. And maybe I'm not really good at Fortnite. I stink at games like Apex, which all my students got me playing. I can't, for some reason in Fortnite, I can't jump and build and do all of the things. We had a joystick and we had Pac-Man, and it was basically like, hey, just don't get eaten by the ghosts. And now, these games are so in depth. So yeah, there's some things that I'm not really good at, but that doesn't mean that the experiences, the wisdom, the things that I've read, the things that I've gone through, it doesn't mean that those things can't benefit you. And if you're a parent and you're listening to this, and most of you that are probably a little older are listening, where some of you that are a little bit younger are probably watching. that's why I created all this back here. And hopefully eventually we'll get another camera here and we'll get someone sitting here. We could, dialogue back and forth. Not quite there yet. I'm hoping to have a bunch of really cool Lego behind me. Not that these aren't cool. There's some cool sets back here. But this one over here, right there. Oh, yeah, that's the Indiana Jones set. So cool. And, of course, being the 80s ADHD guy, that's what I'm going to gravitate towards. Great movie. Great series of movies. Granted, the last one really kind of was tough to see Indiana Jones really old. And you're like, oh, crap. That's happening to me too. So let me dive in a little bit more into who Banglan is, give you a little bit of history, and then we'll just start jumping into the next few episodes. First, caffeinate. So I have told this story for a long time. It was not an easy story for me to tell originally, because when you start diving into your diagnosis and feeling different and the trauma, because there is trauma, you can't not go through some emotional struggles, especially when you're a kid, labeled, diagnosed, and then separated from everybody else. And that's the way they did things back in the 80s. They didn't know as much as what they know now. And also, I don't think that there was that huge concern for mental health either. We didn't talk about anxiety the way that we do now. I mean, nowadays, everybody is struggling with anxiety, and it's a real deal. And I'm not, I'm going to make jokes because that's just what I do. But it's not a laughing matter. The amount and the magnitude of young people and adults that are just struggling every single day with anxiety. And I think that we're going to dedicate a whole episode to just diving into, well, what does that mean? Where does it come from? How do you navigate it? And when you have ADHD and you're good at hyper focusing on stuff, when you're anxious, it is hard to shift, to unhijack your brain. But when I was a kid, I had some issues and some struggles, and they did do some internal damage. I think that what we think really does affect us physically. And I can remember when I got diagnosed with this stuff, I wanted to hide it from everybody. So it's very, very odd to me. Like, in God's great sense of humor, it is like, hey, I'm allowing you to go through these things. And if you do read your Bible, you're going to see a narrative through the scriptures that is centered around the benefit of struggle. And in fact, in one of my favorite books in the Bible, it literally says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of any kind. And if you just pause and stop for a moment and read that and really let it sink in, you're like, that is the craziest thing that I've ever heard. But when you grow and you get a little bit older, and this is why we need to seek out the wisdom from those that have been around for a while, because those that have been here for a long time have gone through things. And if they've actually gone through them, they've learned some things. They've grown through those things. And that there is wisdom. If I can get through something quicker that took you longer because you didn't have the ability to lean on somebody's wisdom, I have benefited and been blessed immensely. And that's really one of my major motivations for why I do what I do. I look back and I remember the incredible difficulty, and yes, it shaped and molded me into who I am today. But if that could have taken less time, boy, how much farther along would I be? I don't know. So the other side of that is there's a feeling of being alone. I don't know where that comes from. It's interesting. I was sharing with a group of students. I think it was out at Polytech High School, and I had a chance to speak. They had about maybe 800 kids in this auditorium, and they really wanted me to talk about isolation. And it's a huge result of the COVID years. Already being a kid is awkward, and then trying to social media, the phone, this has created some atrophy. I mean, if you really think about what is atrophy? Well, it's taking something like a muscle and it's weakening it. And so this has weakened our ability to socialize. When you're a kid and you don't have a phone, and you have this desire and this hunger for a relationship that That's something that we were all created with. You know, going back even to the book of Genesis, it literally says when God created Adam, he realized it wasn't good for him to be alone. He needed somebody that was like him, that he could relate to, talk to, a partner. And so you look from the very beginning of time that community was always a very important thing. And we get this false sense of community through social media, and it has its good and its bad. I mean, I am doing this and it's going to go out on social media because it's the only way that I can reach you guys. And so on that end, you're like, okay, this is a really cool thing. I can reach is a ton of people, you know, and one of the things that I constantly tell myself and what helps me to be consistent, which is a struggle for people that have ADHD, is that if I look at a reel that I've posted and it has like 300 views, that's like being in an auditorium with 300 people listening to me. Yeah, sure. There's this whole, hey, I need to have over 1 million and I need things to go viral, and that can get super distracting. And trust me, I've fallen down that rabbit hole many times. But the reality of it is that, hey, if you can put something out there and make an impact, yeah, there's some good things, but it still doesn't negate the fact that it has created an atrophy when it comes to communicating and talking and looking at people in their eyes and not jumping to the pings, rings, and dings of your phone while you're talking to somebody. So I shared with this group of high school students at Polytech, and it's amazing how we can be in a room of 800 people and absolutely feel alone. It's a feeling inside. And when you feel broken, when you don't fully understand what that brokenness is or why it's there, and you didn't do anything to deserve it. I mean, when you do something wrong and you get punished or you get grounded or you have to go see the principal, or it's actually the vice principal, at least that's who I visited the most. You can say, oh, okay, well, you know, the consequences of my actions and the things that I said, here's the results. And yeah, okay, I deserve that. But then there are times that things happen to you, like a diagnosis or a label like ADHD or LD or LMNOP or whichever letter you want to give these kids, that you did nothing. It's just part of your DNA. It's part of your neurological brain. And they call it a disorder. So that word right there is already loaded with, oh, crap, what's wrong? It's funny. I was, this is a little... a real moment for you. As I'm getting older, there are certain things that I'm struggling with. And I was at the doctor's office and she was saying, you know, I've got this blah, blah, blah disease. And I'm like, what? You know, and as soon as you hear that D word, you're like, oh, crap. And she could see the look on my face. She's like, no, it's not that bad. It's very common. I'm like, you know, she had to kind of reverse the damage that one word did in me. And, you know, I'm a very, how do I explain this? I don't hide my emotion. I'm not somebody who compartmentalizes. If I think something's funny, you're going to know that I know that it's funny. I'm the guy that's going to laugh. If I'm scared or disappointed, you're going to see it. So she saw it and she's like, oh wait, no, it's not that bad. And the same word, the word disorder is the same thing. When you tell a kid, yeah, you got ADHD, attention deficit disorder. Well, okay. Now we got to deal with a whole nother bag of issues. And that's where I was. And I'm going the long route with this story. Maybe we'll turn it into 2 episodes because I do want to have the random ramblings here because I think that through this, there could be some potential nuggets for some of you. You know, I don't want to be bound like I am when I get on stage. They're like, hey, you got 40 minutes to do your thing. All right, well, I got to look through the most important stuff. And sometimes you don't get some of that backstory. And I know some of you that are watching this have seen me speak and perform and are wondering, how in the world did you get to do this? And eventually we'll talk a little bit about the art part of what I do. So I'm also known as the chalk guy. It's not something that I came up with. It was a kid. I was performing my art on stage in front of some elementary school kids, and this one kid couldn't remember my name, and so I'm walking out. He wanted my attention. He actually wanted an autograph, and so he's screaming at me. He's like, hey, chalk dude, chalk man, chalk guy. And at the chalk guy, I turned around, and I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, can you sign my thing? And I went over and I signed it, the chalk guy. Actually, what I put on there was the chalk guy is my friend. And then I drew a picture of a little version of me with hair with 2 thumbs up, 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. So looking back at the diagnosis, when I was in the 3rd grade, they said I was special and all that stuff. And I got labeled all these things, and it was challenging. And so in the 3rd grade, they put me in a special ed classroom. I had 2 classmates. One of my classmates had Down syndrome. Another one of my classmates had a very severe behavior disorder. I believe they called it BD, and that kid was pure entertainment. I mean, I've shared this as a joke, but it's true. There's days you'd look at that kid and you'd be wondering, did he pound a bag of sugar before he came to school? How much Fruit Loops are they giving this kid? And the other student, the girl that had Down syndrome, really was a very precious person in my life at that time, because she was obviously super unique. I had never met anybody with Down syndrome before. And she was one of these individuals that had just this incredible smile that lit up a room. And she was super funny, and she was fun, and she always had to give you a hug. And so when you're a kid whose life has just been turned upside down, and you've been pulled away from everything you know, and you've been told that you're special, or, and you feel damaged or broken, and you have to go to this small classroom, getting a hug and having a smile actually was like a huge blessing. Unfortunately, she was only there for a year, and I was actually only there for a year. That was in Naperville, Illinois, and there was actually, if you drive down Highway 59, I think it's still there, there was a little school called Wheatland Plains, and that's where I got labeled and diagnosed, and we were there for a year, and then we moved off to Plainfield, Illinois, which is just south of there. And it was interesting because a lot of this was really new back then. They were just trying to figure things out. They knew that I couldn't handle the mainstream level class. It wasn't necessarily about intelligence. It wasn't about, was he smart or not smart? And when you're a kid, you don't know that, but it wasn't about that. It was about the style. It's interesting that you can take a young person that has ADHD and put them in an alternative school where they teach them in a way that is more their style, and they thrive and they actually excel in a way that you're like, well, they're brilliant. But the way that they taught back then, I just couldn't focus. I couldn't learn at the same level that everybody else was. And because there was only one teacher in a room for 30 students, you can't put that on her. You couldn't put that on, I think her name was Mrs. Hill. So it was either hold me back or let me go to this, what they called the special ed classroom. And so they put me in the special ed classroom. And that was mostly because of my dad. My dad was just like, hey, holding him back doesn't solve a problem. Doesn't solve. If he's struggling in this class, why will he not continue to struggle next year? It's just going to be a year older. And of course, they were like, well, because he's going to have matured, and because, mentally, with the whole prefrontal cortex thing, it'll develop a little bit more and all of that stuff. And he was just like, no. So they pulled me and put me in that special ed classroom, and I had the 2 classmates for a year. And then we moved to Plainfield. And somewhere between Plainfield and Naperville, they lost some of my paperwork. And so when I got to Plainfield, instead of having to go to the special ed classroom for the whole day, they thought, well, hey, we'll just let him go for an hour. And I thought that was brilliant. Oh my gosh. And I wasn't going to tell him. I was not going to be like, hey, guess what? Somebody made a mistake. Someone fudged up here, and I'm supposed to be here all day. And actually it was crazy. It was called Central Elementary School. And I think it's still there. I don't think it's a school anymore, but it looked like a big U. And I was in the 5th grade at this point, and the 5th grade wing was right here, and all the other kids were around there. But then they had this huge gym on the far end of this parking lot. We had recess in a parking lot. And to get to the special ed classroom, you had to walk outside. And when you walk outside, there are windows all around for every one of the classrooms that are on, that side of the building. And so it was like the walk of shame. you're walking, outside and first of all, everyone thought I escaped from school. They're like, oh, is he ditching? Because they saw me, there's no other kids. It's just me going to what we called the dungeon. And it was underneath the gymnasium. There was this small room. It was a tiny school. They had outgrown it. Plainfield was starting to just boom. And they're like, well, we have all these classrooms taken up. And so they found this room underneath where they have like the water heater or whatever, or the boiler. And so there were all these pipes and everything. And I'll never forget the first time I went down, I'm like, this is super spooky, because you had to walk down these steps right outside the gym. And I can remember walking in there thinking, oh, thank God I don't have to spend an hour here. And then my goal was, hey, do whatever it takes to try not to have to come here at all. And so I wrote a book years ago called Simply Special, Learning to Love Your ADHD. I'm in the middle of updating it right now because I wrote it way back in the early 2000s, and a lot's happened since then. And I wrote a chapter called Cheating 101. And I learned to be an amazing cheater in 5th grade. And it was all about trying to survive. It was all about, hey, I don't want to go to that special ed classroom. That was my sole motivation. I didn't give a rip about education. I didn't give a rip about reading comprehension, spelling, math. I just didn't want to have to do the walk of shame. And so I cheated. And I can remember finding the smartest kid in the class. Her name was Stephanie Colleran. A little shout out to Stephanie if you're listening to this. I think she lives out in Seattle now. Somewhere out west. That's another thing about social media that's kind of cool. You can find where people are that you grew up with from way back when. And so my teacher connected me with her as well. So she kind of became a tutor for me, and she was this cute little blonde, and it was perfect. And but I would literally create these cheat sheets before every test, and then I got caught, and then a really cool thing happened out of that. My teacher, his name was Mr. Boovy. I always have to pronounce it right because I'm like, that just sounds wrong. But Mr. Boovy, who was from Michigan, he did something that I've never forgotten. So most teachers, if they catch a student cheating, you get in trouble, and then you got to go visit the vice principal or whatever that the consequences are. And instead, he was so impressed with how many answers I was able to get on a small little piece of gum wrapper. So all he catches me, grabs my cheat sheet, and I know I'm in trouble. And he tells me, because we're in the middle of the test, he's just like, Mr. Glenn, I need you to wait after I dismiss everybody for recess. So we have this conversation, and he's sitting behind his desk, and he's looking at my cheat sheet, and he's like, did you make this? I'm like, yeah. He's like, this is a lot on just a little piece of paper. And I'm like, yeah, it took a lot of work. He's just like, well, if you would put this much work into studying, then maybe you wouldn't have to make it. And then he just kind of had like one of those little light bulb moments. And so he pulled out a test, and he started asking me questions. And I knew the answers without even looking at the cheat sheet. And he connected the dots. He realized that my process of hunting and asking all of the smart kids for the answers to write on the cheat sheet helped solidify that information in my brain. And so he then created a new task for me before every test. And that was, Mr. Glenn, I'm going to need you to turn in a cheat sheet before every test. Because he learned that hunting, and that's something that ADHD individuals are really good at, is just like that problem solving, hunting, and survival of the fittest type mentality, that would help me academically. And it did. And it so much so that when I did go to middle school without any paperwork getting lost in transit, I was not having to go to the special ed classroom for the whole day. I was just an hour. And by the time you got to middle school, it was no longer called special ed. It was called study skills. They started learning that, hey, we need to maybe change the verbiage here a little bit. And then eventually, years after I graduated, they came up with what they call the inclusion classes, where they have an additional instructor and they've got the special ed students throughout the classroom that need the extra help. And so they kind of covertly help those students without taking them away from everybody else, which I think is good. I can't talk into that from experience because I was always having to go to the special ed class. We always had a separate classroom. And I never did lose that desire to want to never have to go there. And that's where you run into the ego and the that stinking thinking and that feeling of being broken and wanting to prove yourself. And that's a huge part of this. And we'll talk more about that. But eventually I got into high school and I graduated, had a really rough 3 years in middle school. And I might do a pod on that. I could do a whole podcast just on that emotional damage that I had to endure in middle school. And then I did make it to high school, graduated. I have no idea how. And miraculously, I did go to college. I had a basketball scholarship at St. Xavier University in Chicago. And I brought all of my struggles and challenges to that college. And I can remember when I met Paulina, the Russian, I met her in English 101 because and that was the second semester of my freshman year. The very first semester of my freshman year, because of my English being so horrendous, I had to start in English 99. That's a real deal. Usually, if you've ever been to college, English 101, biology 101, math 101. No, they actually had English 99, and I was the only person in that class from this country that spoke really any English. So everyone tried cheating off me. It was a really weird flip. And I'm like, guys, you don't want to cheat off me. I may look local, but I am special with a capital S. When I met my wife, second semester in English 101, we had to write a paper on what we did over our winter break. And back then, our winter break was a month. So, there should be something to write about. And so I wrote maybe a paragraph, not even a whole page. And I exchanged it with her. And that was the assignment. Exchange it with somebody in the class, correct their errors and their mistakes, edit it, and then give it back. And that was our very first assignment. And I thought, well, hey, she's really kind of cute, and I'd like to create some kind of a conversation starter. And so I wrote this paper, just like I write any paper. Gave it to her, and I'm not even exaggerating. And I know I'm a storyteller and I tell things big, but she gave me 5 pages of typed corrections for 1 page. And when she handed it to me, and this is going to give you great insight into the Russian, she literally handed it to me and she said, "This is the worst piece of writing I have ever read. I cannot believe they let you in college." So I married her, I didn't have any choice, but that was college. And then I transferred to Anderson University for a semester. I went to school to be a teacher, did not quite make it. I got to my clinicals, and that was a hot mess that I might talk about later. And then I transferred to Anderson University, and I was there for 1 semester. And then I left. I like to joke, I retired from college, because I believe that God had opened a door for me to go out and to do the art. And that's where that kind of started. It wasn't the speaking. I was not a speaker. I was terrified of public speaking. I hated getting up in front, just that incredible amount of worry and anxiety of everybody staring at you and judging. Because really, anytime you get up front, whether you like to say it or not, they are judging what you're saying. They're processing it. They're looking at the way you're presenting. And so it's no joke when they say that public speaking is the second greatest fear next to death. And so it was the art that really kind of opened that door for me to get in front of groups of people. And eventually people wanted to know why I was doing the art. And I'll talk about that in another pod. But that's the start of the journey to Ben Glenn going out and being a public speaker. And after a few years of doing the art and having my brother on staff, we didn't really have a staff, it was just the 2 of us, my brother and I teaming up, collaborating, and him doing all the speaking and I doing all the art, he just got tired of having to tell people my story or defer people into why I don't get up and tell my story. And finally, he kind of gave me that nudge. Hey, you need to get over this fear thing, and you need to share. And so it might have been maybe that first year. I can't remember. I did very little speaking that first year. That the second year was probably when I started really diving into, hey, when I was in the third grade, they gave me a bunch of tests. When I got done, they said, Ben, you are what we would call special. And that's been my opening line for many, many, many talks for 30 years. And so what I've learned in these 30 years started with that open door. Somebody gave me an opportunity to share my story. And since then till now, during that time frame of 30 years, it has been a journey of learning and growing and researching. And I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a counselor. I am a coach, boxing coach, but I also mentor people. I'm also certified to be an ADHD coach. I think that's a very different thing than a counselor. A coach is somebody that you invite in who can be harsh with you, which can be good. We need to be pushed and challenged, especially if we have ADHD. And so what I want to do during this podcast is just dive into a bunch of these things that I've learned, and then also share with you the way that I'm processing these things even today. My wife reminded me of this the other day as I was transitioning. Give you a little nugget into something that you may already know, or this is going to be one of those aha moments for you. People that have ADHD really do need to have structure. And when they find that structure, or you can even call it a project, they thrive. They are at their best. A lot of times, if it's something that they really enjoy doing, they're going to hyper focus on that, and they are just going to be banging on all cylinders. And hyper focus, on some sense, can be bad, and we'll talk about that. But then there are moments where hyper focus is like, oh my gosh, this is a superpower, because just the longevity and the focus and the productivity is insane. Unfortunately, it's not sustainable. Because eventually what happens is you finish the project. And so I recently had a project, and then when you finish a project, you enter into what we have dubbed the transition stage. And that transition stage can be very painful. It can be productive in its own way, but it's painful because what you're doing as an ADHD individual is trying to find the next project. Best thing to do is before you end this project is to have one ready for you. But even if you do that, you have to figure out a way to filter out the structures and the routines that you had implemented to achieve that original project so that they don't distract you from getting started on the new project. And all of that, we'll dive into all that stuff. And during this transition time, my wife looked at me and she reminded me of something that I forget. Oh, hey, by the way, Ben, you have ADHD. Crap. She's right. She's absolutely right. And I forget because I'm always advocating, I'm always talking, I'm always sharing. As somebody once called me the simple ADHD expert, I try to break things down that are super complex so that people that have ADD can actually understand it. I mean, half the stuff that's written out there, you're like, I have to have a doctorate to understand some of this stuff, or, have some kind of hello, Google, can you please tell me what the word comorbidity means? So if you have found this podcast, I hope you will journey with me. I apologize if it is a little bit all over the place, but I've decided that, hey, I'm just going to be authentic. I'm just going to be me. And hopefully you guys get something out of it. As we get this thing ramped up, if you do have questions or you do want to dive into a specific topic, feel free to leave comments. Let me know. I'm doing this for you. But I'm going to be honest, it's good for me too. It's always good when we take time to look back at our own unique stories and the way that things have played out and the things that God has taught you and how he's shaped and molded you into the men or women that you were meant to be. And it's also really encouraging to know that, hey, because I have endured and made it through these things, I can continue to endure. Because life doesn't stop throwing you curveballs. There's always going to be ups and downs and all arounds, and that's just the roller coaster of life. So we're going to end with this. This has been about 40 minutes. I wanted to keep these under an hour, and so I will just jump back in with the second episode. Second episode is titled Understanding ADHD. So I'm going to try to dive into what ADHD is. I'll give you some of the clinical stuff, but then I'm going to give you my take on it. And hopefully that'll be an encouragement to you, because there's a lot of stuff out there. And maybe some of you are like, can someone just break it down and make it easy to understand? It's overwhelming. And it is overwhelming. So, all right, guys, this is Ben Glenn, and I hope you've enjoyed my podcast. As always, love, peace, and, oh yes, Lego bricks. God bless.